He threw my life onto the lawn like it meant nothing. I stood on the front step and watched my clothes land in the grass, a sweater catching on a shrub, a bag hitting the path with a sound that was somehow both quiet and enormous. The porch light was on. The street was still. And somewhere behind me, in the house that had my name on the mortgage, my husband was pulling open drawers and closets with the focused energy of someone who had decided something irreversible and was moving quickly before the decision could be questioned. I had been in this marriage for 9 years. I had managed the home, raised our daughter, worked part-time, loved him carefully through his ambition and his distance, and his growing certainty that my contributions were somehow less significant than his. I had stayed when staying was the wrong answer because I believed the family was worth holding together. And now my things were in the grass and my daughter was watching from an upstairs window, and 11 days from that moment my phone would have 99 missed calls from the man who had just decided I had overstayed my place in his life. What he didn't understand, as he threw open another drawer, was what he'd just set in motion. My name is Megan. I am 34 years old, and the most accurate thing anyone could say about me is that I stayed. I stayed in a neighborhood that was never quite mine. I stayed in a role that expanded quietly over the years. Part-time worker, full-time mother, full-time manager of a household that ran on invisible labor nobody counted. I stayed in a marriage that gave me less and less while taking more and more, because I had a 6-year-old daughter named Lily, and I had watched my own childhood pulled apart by instability, and I was determined she would not know that feeling. Lily is the person I organize myself around. Every decision I have made in the last 6 years, the job I kept small so I could be present, the arguments I swallowed so the house would stay calm, the compromises I made so quietly I sometimes forgot I had made them, was made with her in the center of the calculation. She has her father's stubborn jaw and my tendency to notice everything quietly, without saying anything immediately. She is 6 years old and understands more than we give children credit for. She was at the window when her father threw my things onto the lawn. I will not forget her face. My husband's name is Tyler. When I married him at 25, he was ambitious in the way that is attractive before you understand its costs. He had a plan for everything, a confidence that felt solid under difficult circumstances, and a way of making you feel that being part of his plans was a privilege worth keeping. I believed that for a long time. Over 9 years, Tyler became successful in the way he had always intended. A senior position at a financial firm, a house in a neighborhood with good schools, the reliable external markers of a life well built. What the external markers didn't show was the internal architecture, the growing impatience, the way he had begun talking about my contribution in the past tense, as though I had already been quietly filed under less relevant. The comments that came more frequently as his status grew, that I depended on him, that my part-time income was decorative, that the life we had was something he had built and maintained. I did not argue these points directly. I knew what the marriage document said. I knew what the financial agreements contained. I had read them carefully in a way that quiet people read things, without announcing that they have done so. The neighborhood we lived in was the kind where lawns were kept and opinions were managed. People noticed things without saying anything directly. They had mastered the art of the significant glance, the meaningful pause, the question asked in a tone that was really an observation. I had never fully belonged to the social ecosystem of that street. I was the wife of the man in the corner house, the mother of the girl who was always polite, the woman who did the grocery run on Wednesday mornings and kept the front garden well, and never seemed to have a particularly interesting story to tell. This suited me. I had learned early that being underestimated had a practical value. People told you things they wouldn't tell someone they considered significant. They made decisions around you rather than including you. They forgot to watch you while they were watching everything else. I had been quietly watching that neighborhood for 4 years. I knew which neighbors noticed everything and told no one, which ones told everyone and noticed nothing, and which one, a woman named Vera, 3 houses down, had been a real estate attorney before she retired and still kept her license current out of habit and professional stubbornness. Vera would matter later. The tension in our marriage had been building towards something for most of the previous year. It was the kind of building that doesn't produce a single definitive moment, but rather a slow accumulation of small structural failures, a conversation that ends too quickly, a dinner that happens in separate silences, a decision announced rather than discussed. Tyler had stopped including me. He made financial moves without telling me until after the fact. He attended events alone that we had previously attended together. He spoke to his colleagues about plans that involved our shared life, as though I were a variable he had already accounted for rather than a person whose agreement he required. And the comments continued. The contributions comments. The dependency comments. The comments about how I didn't understand the complexity of what he managed, which were true in the narrow technical sense and profoundly false in the broader human sense. I managed complexity every day. I simply did it in rooms he didn't consider significant. I had, by then, consulted a lawyer. Not dramatically, just as a reasonable person who understood that the ground was shifting should. I had gathered information. I knew what I had signed. I knew what those signatures meant. The argument that night started over money. It always did, in the end, not because money was the actual issue, but because money was the language Tyler used when what he really meant was control. He had made a decision about a shared account without telling me. I had noticed. I asked about it in the even, careful tone I had developed over years of navigating his temper, which was not explosive, but was cold in a way that was harder to manage than heat. He said I didn't understand finances. I said I understood our finances specifically. He escalated in the way he did, not shouting, just compressing his words until they had the quality of something pressurized. He said I contributed nothing of substance. I said that was not accurate, and I could demonstrate it. He said I was making his life harder. I said I was making his life possible, and he had simply stopped noticing the difference. Lily was upstairs. I could hear the small sounds of her getting ready for bed, the particular creak of the second-floor bathroom door, the sound of the faucet. The house around us was doing its ordinary evening things while the conversation below it moved toward something that would not be ordinary at all. It happened quickly. Tyler said something, the exact words I have mostly let go of because holding them precisely would require giving them more space in my memory than they deserve, and then he walked past me to the closet near the front door and took out my coat and threw it through the open front door onto the porch. Then he went upstairs. I heard drawers. I heard the sound of our bedroom closet. He came back down with an armful of my things, clothes, a bag, a box from the top shelf, and he walked to the front door and threw them onto the lawn. He did not shout while he did it. He spoke in the controlled, certain voice of someone executing a decision. He said he was simplifying things. He said I had overstayed my place in his life. He said this was the most honest he had been with me in years, which was probably true in a way he didn't fully intend. The noise from inside the house had stopped. The neighborhood was quiet. And then I looked up at the house and saw Lily at her bedroom window, small face, wide eyes, completely still, watching what her father was doing to her mother's things on the lawn. I did not react the way I had imagined I might if something like this ever happened. I had imagined, in the abstract way you imagine worst-case scenarios you hope will never occur, that I would say something definitive and precise that would cut through the situation and restore some dignity. Instead, I said nothing. I stood on the path and I looked at the things on the lawn, and I felt something settle in me. Not calm exactly, but the thing that comes after you have been waiting for something for a long time, and it has finally arrived, and the waiting is over. The neighbors had noticed. I saw a light change in a window across the street. A door opened 2 houses down, and then closed again. Vera's porch light was on. Nobody intervened. That didn't surprise me. These were people who managed appearances, and this was someone else's scene to manage. I began gathering my things from the grass methodically, piece by piece, without rushing. Tyler stood in the doorway for a while, and then went inside. When I had gathered what I needed, I went inside, went upstairs, and got Lily. I told her we were going to Aunt Carol's for a few days. She took my hand without asking why. We left. Aunt Carol lived 20 minutes away in a smaller, less curated neighborhood where nobody cared much about the performance of having things together. She met us at the door without asking questions she knew I couldn't answer in front of Lily. She made up the spare room, and she made tea, and she sat with me after Lily was asleep, and she said the only thing worth saying, which was, "What do you need?" I told her I needed 3 things. I needed time for Lily to stabilize. I needed to make some calls in the morning. And I needed her not to tell anyone what had happened yet. She said she could manage all 3. I slept that night in a way I had not slept in months. Not well, exactly, but deeply, the way you sleep when something heavy has been removed even if what replaced it is uncertain. In the morning, I made my calls. I called my lawyer first. I explained what had happened the previous evening, including the timing, the witnesses, and the specific nature of the assets and agreements that Tyler appeared to have forgotten existed when he decided to throw my belongings onto the front lawn of a house that was, in certain significant legal ways, not solely his. My lawyer's name was Iris. She was practical in the way that good lawyers are practical. She did not offer comfort, but she offered clarity, which was more useful. I had first spoken to her 8 months earlier, in the quiet preliminary way of someone who hopes not to need what they are preparing for. At that meeting, I had gone through our financial arrangements in detail. I had explained the mortgage, both names, specific terms, the joint accounts, the investment account opened during our marriage that Tyler had always treated as primarily his but which was legally and definitively not. The business agreement. Tyler's firm had a spousal disclosure component that he had, over the past year, begun to treat as a formality rather than a binding condition. Iris had listened to all of this with the focused attention of someone assembling a picture. She had told me what my position was. She had told me what Tyler's position was. And she had told me that if he made any significant unilateral move, financial, legal, or domestic, the picture would change considerably in my direction. He had made a domestic move the previous evening, in front of witnesses, at the home where our daughter's primary residence was established. Iris said, "All right, let's begin." I did not contact Tyler that day, or the next day, or the day after that. I maintained the silence the way you maintain something that is working by not interfering with it. I managed the practical things. Lily's school routine from Aunt Carol's, which required some logistics, but was workable. My part-time work, which I continued from Carol's kitchen table, without interruption. The calls to Iris as information developed. The one conversation with my sister, who lived 3 states away and whose immediate response was to offer to drive to Tyler's house and explain the situation to him personally, which I declined with genuine affection. Tyler did not call on day 1. He texted once, in the late evening, a message that was brief and contained a version of an explanation that was not quite an apology and not quite a justification but lived in the uncomfortable space between them. I read it and did not respond. On day 2, he called twice. I did not answer. On day 3, he called 4 times and left a voicemail that I listened to once. His voice had lost the compression of the argument night. It had something else in it now. The particular quality of a person who has just begun to understand what they have done. By day 5, I understood what had changed on Tyler's end. Iris had sent the initial correspondence, formal, precise, laying out the legal position regarding our shared assets and the terms of our mortgage agreement and the spousal disclosure component of his firm's financial compliance requirements. This last item was the one Tyler appeared to have not fully considered when he made his decision about simplifying things. His firm's compliance rules required disclosure of significant changes in spousal financial arrangements, changes that could affect his handling of certain client accounts. Throwing your wife's belongings onto the lawn of your jointly owned home and effectively removing her from the residence was, it turned out, the kind of change that compliance departments considered significant. I did not engineer this. I had simply read the documents I had signed and asked a lawyer what they meant. Tyler had signed the same documents and apparently not read them with the same attention. By day 5, his firm's compliance officer had been in contact with Iris's office. Tyler's calls went from twice a day to 4 times a day. The messages shifted from explanations to requests, then to something more urgent. I continued not to answer. Lily asked me on day 6 why we were still at Aunt Carol's. She asked it in the careful way she raised difficult things, not directly but by approaching the edges of the question and waiting to see if I would open the door. I told her that Daddy and I were working some things out and that we would have a clearer picture soon. She considered this for a moment. Then she asked if we were going to be okay. I told her we were already okay, that she was okay and I was okay, and that the things we were working out were grown-up things that didn't change those facts. She studied me with the particular assessment children use when they are determining whether an adult is being honest or careful. Then she nodded and went back to the drawing she was working on. She was drawing a house. Not our house, a different one. with a garden and a very large dog, neither of which we had. Children process things through the futures they imagine. I watched her draw and thought about the house 3 streets from where we were sitting, with east-facing windows and a garden that could accommodate almost any size dog. By day 8, the calls were coming 6 and 7 times a day. The voicemails had a new quality. Tyler was specific now, whereas before he had been vague. He was specific about wanting to talk. Specific about the word misunderstanding. Specific in one message about the compliance issue, which told me he had been briefed and was attempting to contain the situation through me. I listened to each voicemail once and did not respond. Iris and I spoke daily. The picture that was developing was cleaner than I had expected, not because Tyler had made one large mistake, but because he had made several connected ones, each of which would have been manageable alone but which together formed a pattern that was difficult to argue with. The spousal disclosure issue. The unilateral movement of funds from the joint account in the 72 hours before the lawn incident. The timing of certain financial decisions he had made in the previous 3 months, which, taken in sequence, suggested a preparation I had not been aware of. Each of these pieces, individually, was a complication. Together, they were a case. Iris did not use the word leverage. She used the word position. My position, she said, was considerably stronger than Tyler had apparently calculated. On day 9, something happened that I had not anticipated. Vera, the retired real estate attorney 3 houses down, whose porch light had been on the night of the lawn incident, called me. She had gotten my number through Aunt Carol, in the particular way information moves through tight social networks when someone decides it should. She said she had seen what happened. She said she had been in her garden that evening and had observed the situation clearly. She said she had written down what she observed the following morning, dated and signed, in the professional habit she had never quite dropped. She was not sure if it would be useful but wanted me to have it available if it was. I thanked her. I said it might be very useful indeed. I sent her contact information to Iris, who called her the same afternoon. Iris told me that Vera's documentation was precise, detailed, and written with the precision of a former attorney, exactly the language that made it most useful in exactly the context in which we might need it. Tyler had thrown my things onto the lawn of our shared home in front of a retired attorney who had immediately written it all down. Day 10 was quiet. The calls came, 7 of them, but I had moved past listening to voicemails individually. I had Iris receiving and logging them as part of the documented record. Tyler had also sent 2 emails. These were more formal than the voicemails, which told me he had probably had some legal guidance of his own and was attempting to create a paper trail that reframed the events. Iris reviewed them. She said they were not a problem. The framing he was attempting was inconsistent with the established timeline and the documentation we had accumulated. I spent day 10 doing ordinary things. I helped Lily with a school project about animals. I made a grocery run. I sat with Carol in the evening and watched a program neither of us found particularly interesting but which gave us something to be in the same room with. I thought about the 9 years of the marriage, not with regret exactly, but with a specific clarity of distance. There were good years in there. There was a version of Tyler I had loved. None of that made what happened on the lawn acceptable. It simply made it complicated. Complicated, I had found, was something I was capable of holding. On day 11, I looked at my phone, and there were 99 missed calls logged. This was not a coincidence. It was simply what 11 days of calling without response produced when you added the numbers. I sat with the phone in my hand and thought about what those 99 calls represented. 9 years earlier, Tyler had called me on our first date with the particular attentiveness of someone who has decided you matter. Now he was calling me 99 times with the desperation of someone who has discovered that the thing they discarded was load-bearing. Those were very different kinds of calls. I put the phone down. I called Iris. I told her I was ready to move to the next stage. She said the documents were prepared. She said we could file at the end of the week if I confirmed. I confirmed. Then I called Tyler. Not because he deserved the call and not to give him anything he was asking for, but because there were practical matters to discuss that affected Lily's routine, and Lily's routine was not something I was willing to let become collateral damage in the management of my own situation. I answered on my own terms. That was all I had ever wanted. The conversation with Tyler on day 11 lasted 14 minutes. I did not raise my voice. I did not revisit the night of the lawn, the years of comments, or the specific failures of those 9 years. I spoke in the practical register of someone who has moved past the emotional architecture of a situation and is now managing its practical consequences. I told him that Lily was well and her school routine was continuing without disruption. I told him I had retained counsel and that going forward all legal and financial matters would be handled through that channel. I had no interest in escalating anything, and what happened next would be determined entirely by how the practical matters were handled. He tried several times to turn the conversation toward explanations. I did not follow him there. He mentioned the compliance issue. I said that was something his counsel and my counsel could address. He said he hadn't meant for things to go this far. I said I believed him. He hadn't anticipated what going this far would actually look like. He had assumed the power he had in the house would transfer cleanly to the world outside it. It had not. The world outside had different rules. I had read those rules carefully. The filing happened on a Friday. Iris managed it with the precision I had come to expect from her. Every document in order, every timeline established, every piece of the accumulated picture presented clearly and without embellishment. The response from Tyler's side took 4 days, which told me his counsel was either being careful or had advised him to be. Probably both. In the weeks that followed, the practical shape of what came next began to emerge. The house, which was jointly owned, entered a process that would take time, but was proceeding on terms that reflected the documented situation accurately. The financial accounts were frozen pending review, which was inconvenient but expected. The compliance matter at Tyler's firm was handled internally, but not quietly. These things rarely are, and the people who needed to know knew. I heard about this through professional channels that Iris had, which was appropriate. I did not discuss it with anyone who didn't need the information. The image Tyler had worked to maintain competent, successful, in control was not destroyed. But it had developed cracks in exactly the places where the reality didn't match the presentation, and those cracks were visible to the people whose opinion mattered most to him professionally. Lily and I moved into the new house 6 weeks after the lawn. It was 3 streets from Carol's, with east-facing windows and a garden that was larger than it needed to be for 2 people, which I considered an opportunity rather than an excess. Lily had requested outdoor space, citing the imaginary large dog she intended to eventually acquire, and I had taken this request seriously, as information about what she needed rather than what she wanted. The move was manageable. We did not have many things, because I had prioritized carefully in the weeks since leaving. I had taken what was mine specifically and what Lily needed and left the rest for the process to sort out, which it was doing at its own legal pace. On the first evening in the new house, Lily and I made dinner together at the kitchen table, pasta, which was her current preference, and she asked if we could get a plant for the kitchen window. I said yes. She picked out a small one the following Saturday, carried it home herself, and placed it on the sill with the satisfaction of someone making a first claim on a new space. That was exactly what it was. Tyler's calls did not stop immediately after the filing. They shifted in character, less urgent, more formal, the calls of someone who has been advised to manage communication carefully. I continued to direct everything through Iris. There were weeks when this required discipline because the ordinary logistics of shared parenthood, Lily's schedule, her activities, the decisions that needed 2 parents to make, created contact points that could have become something else if I had let them. I did not let them. I was polite. I was specific. I kept every exchange brief and documented. This was not because I felt nothing. I felt considerable things during that period, most of them complicated, and some of them genuinely sad, because 9 years of a life together is not nothing even when the ending is as it was. But feelings and decisions are different instruments, and I had learned to use them separately. The decisions I was making were about Lily's stability and my own footing, and those decisions required a clarity that feelings could cloud if I allowed it. I did not allow it. I made the decisions I needed to make, and I felt the feelings I needed to feel, and I kept those 2 activities in separate rooms. 6 months after the lawn, I returned to full-time work. This was a decision I had been building toward for longer than the marriage had been failing, A return to the professional version of myself set aside when Lily arrived and the household required more than two part-time efforts could manage. I had kept my skills current in the quiet way I kept most things, without announcing it, without making it a project, just maintaining what I had. The professional network I stepped back into was smaller than it had been, but intact in the ways that mattered. My first full-time role back was not glamorous. It was the kind of position where you demonstrate what you can do before you negotiate what you're worth. I was comfortable with that because demonstrations, done well, are their own kind of argument. Within 4 months, I had made the argument. I negotiated. I received what I had asked for. Lily started second grade the same week I received that offer, wearing a new backpack she had chosen herself, a deep red one with a small embroidered fox on the front pocket. She was proud of it. I was proud of us both, in the private way of someone watching something difficult become something that holds. People in the old neighborhood talked. I heard fragments of this through the social channels that connect people who have moved on from a place but remain loosely tethered to it. The version of events that circulated was not entirely accurate. These things never are, but it was more accurate than I might have expected. The image of me as someone who had depended on Tyler and been unable to function without the structure he provided did not survive contact with the actual sequence of events. What replaced it was not dramatic. I was not recast as any kind of hero, which I would not have wanted. I was simply understood more accurately, as someone who had managed more than people had noticed, as someone who had left with more than people expected, as someone who had, apparently, read every document she had ever signed. The last of these became a kind of shorthand in the retelling. People who heard the story and wanted to draw a lesson from it seemed to land on that one. Read what you sign. I had no objection to that lesson. It was accurate, and it was useful, and it had a kind of practical poetry to it that I thought was appropriate. Tyler and I arrived at a settlement 14 months after the lawn. It was fair in the precise legal sense, constructed from documentation, not emotion, which is the only foundation a settlement can reliably hold. Tyler had, through his counsel, attempted several approaches that the accumulated record did not support. Each of those approaches was addressed by Iris with the same measured precision she had brought to everything. The final terms reflected the actual weight of the situation rather than the version Tyler had initially imagined. He signed. I signed. We became people who shared a daughter and a history and a legal agreement, and not very much else. I did not feel triumphant on the day we signed. I felt, more than anything, finished in the good sense of that word, the sense that means completed rather than destroyed. Something had been concluded properly. Something that had been broken for longer than the lawn incident had finally been accounted for in language that both parties had to acknowledge. I drove home from Iris's office that afternoon, picked up Lily from school, and we made dinner, and I helped her with her reading, and she fell asleep on the couch, and I carried her to bed. Ordinary. Exactly what ordinary is for. I think about the lawn sometimes. Not often. I have given it the space it deserves, which is not very much, but sometimes. What I think about most is not the humiliation of that evening, which was real, and which I do not minimize. I think about the particular quality of the silence that settled in me as I gathered my things from the grass. Not defeat. Not despair. The silence of a person who has just been released from something they had been holding past the point where holding on served any purpose. He threw my things onto the lawn believing he was taking something from me. He was giving me something, the clarity I had been too careful, too hopeful, too committed to Lily's intact family to find for myself. The 99 calls told the rest of the story, not because he had reconsidered the relationship, but because he had reconsidered his position. And position was not what he had assumed. I had east-facing windows and a garden and a daughter who had just asked if we could get a dog. I told her yes. She named him before we even picked him out. I had given that to her. And in the past 14 months, I had given it back to myself.